Okay, so good evening, everyone, and welcome to our informal presentation of the Odessa today, the Odessa Review magazine. I'd like to begin by just talking a little bit about English language media in Ukraine. My name is Peter Dickinson. I've been in Ukraine for almost 18 years, and I've been involved in quite a lot of the English language media projects in Ukraine to date. To give you a brief background, I was one of the founder editors of What's On magazine, which was founded in 1999, ran until 2014. I'm currently the publisher of Business Ukraine magazine and Lviv Today, and also the editor-at-large with the Odessa Review. The English language scene in Ukraine is quite limited, I would say, compared to a lot of countries in the region, compared to Russia or also Eastern Europe. There have been a number of publications over the years, but Ukraine in general tends to have quite a low profile internationally and tends to have a lack of information about it in the English language media, which often has quite a can have a negative impact on the country. So everybody involved in the English language media, I think, is very conscious of the fact that the outside audiences don't have a lot of information about Ukraine from a Ukrainian perspective. Very often the information about Ukraine in English comes either from international media or from Russian sources. So it's not always what the Ukrainian audiences or the Ukrainian constituency would wish to be out there. So the work that we do is very much geared to introducing international audiences to the real Ukraine, the Ukraine that people who live here from the international community know and that we love, we choose to support. The Odessa Review publication is now, you will find on your seats, the second issue. It's a new monthly publication that is designed to introduce Odessa to the international audience, to the outside world. It's the first English language publication for Odessa and about Odessa, so it's historic in that sense. It's very much part of the new wave of efforts to introduce the world to Ukraine. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce from Odessa, who's come here especially today, Vladislav Davidzon, who is the chief editor of the project. Vladislav, please.
Thank you, Peter. I want to thank my friend Peter Dickinson, who's a great support, and without him, we would not have been able to start this magazine, not have been able to launch it. We would not have been able to bring it to fruition. Also, we should thank America House for having us. It's a great institution. The last time I was here was to get my wife a visa, and I want to also thank my my publisher, Mr. Habits Youssef, who couldn't be with us here today, but is a great Ukrainian and a great supporter of Ukrainian independent media, and a great just a great publisher. And you could read a little bit about him in the magazine. Yeah, so we are a monthly English language cultural magazine focused on the new Ukrainian culture, new civic-minded, new contemporary Ukrainian culture. We cover, see on the front, it says events, culture, business, and lifestyle. Probably not quite in that order, but that is our remit, that is our mandate. Welcome. Thanks for coming. We are based in Odessa, and we print in Kiev, and we have a fairly large editorial staff. We have me and my people in Odessa. We have my great friend Peter Dickinson in Kiev as the managing editor. We have a small skeleton crew in New York City of Odessa expats. We also have my wife and partner and my managing partner in my life and in this project, Regina Marinovska-Davozin. But her also would not be able to do this. So she's a Ukrainian citizen, so we do need a Ukrainian on board. I'm an American. So, Peter, what else should we say?
Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about the key themes that are covered and the concept of promoting Odessa. You know, what is Odessa to international audiences? What do they know about it? What are perhaps the misconceptions?
Yeah, Odessa. Odessa is a remarkable town, and Odessa is, in terms of a known brand, in terms of a face in literature to the world. This is Ukraine's biggest asset in many ways. Odessa is a cradle of literature. It's a cradle of political consciousness. Historically, it's a cradle of at least 3 or 4 national liberation movements: the Greek, the Jewish, the Bulgarian. They all had their intellectuals sitting around cafes talking until they figured out they wanted to start their own country. Odessa is a remarkable town. It's the southern access of the Black Sea trade routes. It is also the southern capital of the country. It's a financial hub. It's also tied of Lviv to be the second tourist capital of the country. And it's just a really great place. It's a shipping hub. It's a shipping access. It's a political corridor that's very important for the former Soviet Union, for connecting Ukraine to Romania, and through Romania to the European Union. Now we have Governor Saakashvili. He's along with the Kazakhs and the Chinese. He has started something called the New Golden Route. So there's shipping directly from the European Union through Odessa, down the Bosphorus to Turkey, from Turkey all along Turkey to Kazakhstan, and from Kazakhstan to China. So it's a pivotal trade route, and it's always been that way. So it's very important to remember about Odessa. Business aside, Odessa is a real incubator for culture. It's a real incubator for talented people, many of them who leave Odessa. They go on to do something else in New York or Berlin or in Paris, like my wife immigrated to Paris. Many people go to Kiev, they go to Tel Aviv, or they go to New York. It's a great place in terms of getting your foot in the door and getting an education and starting something. So Odessa has historically, in contemporary times, produced a lot of very interesting people and remarkable personalities. If I was just going to sit here and go through all the historical personages that came out of Odessa, we would be here till 4 in the morning. So we're not going to do that. Anything
it's
else?
A long list. It's a very long list. Yeah, Odessa is special like that. As someone, my background is in Kiev almost exclusively, although I began my Ukrainian life in Lviv, and have since come back to start an English language publication there. But I think both Kiev and Lviv are, in terms of brand names, significantly smaller in some respects than Odessa. Although Odessa is not the capital of the country, it is in many ways the most high-profile city in Ukraine in terms of international brand recognition. So in some ways, it's surprising that Odessa had never had until now an English language publication. In the very late 1990s, when I first arrived, there was actually an attempt by the Kiev Post to expand into the Odessa market with what was called the Odessa Post. So basically, it was the Kiev Post rebranded for Odessa, and it didn't succeed at the time because largely the people in Odessa were quite offended, I would say, that someone should try to speak for Odessa when they were obviously from Kiev. And I remember being in Odessa at the time and having Odessans say, "Oh, look at this! You know, they think we're stupid. You know, they put the Odessa on it and they think we'll think it's ours." So when the idea arose to do an Odessa publication, it was very important, in my mind at least, to make it very much an Odessa project for Odessans, that they would look at and feel that it was something reflecting their identity and their civic pride, their localized sense of identity. The very strong message that I always get from Odessa is the sense of belonging and pride. That people are Odessans, they're from Odessa, they're very, very happy about that, and they're very keen to share that with people. And we're very lucky to have Vlad, who's based in Odessa, and also Regina, who is from Odessa, who were able to share that Odessa flavor with the publication. So the content of the magazine is also tailored towards that, in terms of making it quite a cultural magazine, quite a intellectual magazine, I would say. Thank you. To reflect the great, without making it sound critical, the pretensions of Odessa to be an international, global city with genuine global pretensions. It's still early. It's only the second issue, but I think that we've so far hit that mark, and we'll certainly continue in that vein. It may be that the magazine can grow into a national product for Ukraine, or a regional product for the whole region. I'm reminded of the trajectory of growth of the British newspaper The Guardian, which some of you may be aware was the Manchester Guardian when it first came out, and it was in many respects it was a counterpoint to the media based in London. So you had in the early 20th century, the 19th century, you had the Times of London, the Daily Mail, publications, they're all based in London. The Manchester Guardian was an alternative voice. Now it went from being a city publication in Manchester, based in Manchester, to becoming now a national and actually a very prominent international voice. So there are precedents in media for regional publications and regional titles taking on national, international scope. That would be something that we'd love to see for the Odessa Review. Obviously, it's very early days to be talking about that, but it is something that already, given the brand that Odessa has, is already an option, so to speak.
I think it would be. There's a lot more to say, and we're going to say it in just 1 minute. But I think we do have a little video that we should play. Yulia, could you yeah. I'd like to add to that, but I think at first we want to show this presentation that we have at the magazine. Thank you. So I think that shows to a great extent how glamorous the city is and how remarkable it is, and so it's it's a very enticing place to live, and it's a very exciting time. And it's no accident, comrade, as the Trotskyists used to say, that Governor Saakashvili came to Odessa to make his mark in Ukrainian politics. Obviously, as national and international ambitions, but he saw the springboard for his national ambitions be Odessa, and I think that's no accident, is it? Again, right?
Well, if you were looking at Ukraine and you were given if it was said you need to go to a regional center to be a governor before you can take on a national role, then I think Odessa would be the #1 choice for most politicians, except perhaps Dnipropetrovsk, but I understand that was taken at the time.
Dnipropetrovsk was taken at the time. Also, Dnipropetrovsk does not have a beach.
Also true.
It doesn't have the beach. The weather is worse. And, it's not much of a choice. Let's talk a little bit about the content. Peter said that we are hoping to be a national publication. That's absolutely true. As much as the West needs Ukraine and coherent, correct, insightful, locally sourced, locally reported, stylish coverage of Ukrainian politics, just as much Ukraine needs the West. So it's not a one-directional bridge. People in New York and Berlin and Paris and London are interested in Ukraine in a way that they were not up until 3 years ago, for obvious reasons. And that interest needs to be tapped into, and it needs to be built upon so that Ukraine can have a proper place in the world in terms of security, in terms of business, in terms of pulling its weight and punching in its weight class, because this was not the case 3 years ago. And there are a lot of important reasons, there are a lot of interesting reasons why that was the case. In fact, you and I wrote an op-ed. In fact, you were the lead writer on the op-ed that we published at the Atlantic Council's Ukraine Alert series. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that it's not necessarily something that people in Ukraine always appreciate. I think that there is a sense that publications like the Odessa Review, like the Kiev Post, like the other publications that I'm involved in, the local English language media, are for the expat community living here. And there's truth in that. It is, to an extent, for the people living here, for our convenience, for our information, to allow us to know a little bit more about the country we're living in, especially if we don't have the language skills. But I think that's quite a small part of what these publications can do. I think on a much more significant scale, they offer a window for the outside world. And this is a very important point, that something I feel very strongly about, that Ukraine for a long time has not very successfully projected itself internationally. There's been a very weak image internationally. Unfortunately, a lot of the associations with Ukraine have tended to be of a negative character. So it's Chernobyl, it's corruption, it was instability, poverty, etc., organized crime, perhaps, very negative things which do exist here, of course, but there are a lot of positive stories that were overlooked. That was always an issue that I felt throughout my time here. But now, over the last 2.5 years, we see that actually it's not just an opportunity cost, it's actually a security threat. Because what we've seen is that the Kremlin has been able to come into the situation and tell people internationally, using a much louder voice than Ukraine has, using the much more sophisticated and perhaps simply just louder and bigger media platforms that Russia is able to finance and has developed, has been able to project a very distorted and negative view of Ukraine to international audiences. And because Ukraine has not previously put across its own image, the Russian image has been accepted to a significant extent. Now, I very often read comments on stories, and you never know today whether they're genuine comments or whether they've been planted by someone or whether it's part of a specific information operation or not. But disinformation, exactly. But I think that, in all fairness, I don't think we can write everything that appears off to be the work of Kremlin trolls. I think there is a certain knock-on effect, and it's very, very disheartening when you read comments from people who are obviously quite educated people in terms of the way they write and express themselves, but absolutely no idea about what Ukraine is actually all about. If I actually was going to just very, very simple example, but I brought the board out because I wanted to make the point of saying, if I come this side on the camera, if I wanted to say what is the Western impression of Ukraine, what is the image of Ukraine in the West, I would say, well, this is it. There is no image. It's a blank piece of paper. So what we've seen over the last 2 years is the Russians have come along and said, I'll show you what Ukraine is. This is Ukraine. No, this is Ukraine. That's Ukraine. That's Ukraine. not sure if that's correctly done or it's the other way around, but they've said it's a Nazi country, it's a fascist country, it's a junta, whatever they wanted to say. So now, because Ukraine doesn't have an image, Ukraine has to come along and try to to cross this out, to change it. But we have to exert an awful lot of energy to try to take away the negatives. Whereas if there'd been more of an effort at the start to try to present Ukraine it doesn't have to be overly positive, but just to project the realities of Ukraine, then when the Russians attempted these strategies, they wouldn't have succeeded. If they'd attempted such a strategy against a country with a more prominent image, like Germany or France or something, it would have been actually a redundant effort. It would have been foolish and perhaps counterproductive. So I think there's a very real opportunity cost, to the lack of projection of image, and now we are all playing catch up. So projects like the Odessa Review are part of that effort. I've also was involved with the TV channel Ukraine Today. And we are soon to be launching a new state-funded channel, which will be called UATV, which will be launched. It's actually going to be a state broadcaster, which will be independent. So it will be financed by the state, but independent, editorial independent. This will hopefully launch in September. So these are important elements of the fight back. My personal experience is that the cultural and perhaps the soft power aspects of projecting the country's image are maybe more important than the hard news. So while it's important to report on what's happening on the front lines in East Ukraine, what's happening in occupied Crimea, what's happening in the Verkhovna Rada or the politics in Kiev, and the hard news issues, in my experience, it can actually make much more of an impression to report on cultural aspects. So to report on Ukrainian, for example, fashion, musical scene. Jamal obviously is a great example. Literature, yeah, and to report on the cinema, things that actually people will consume with pleasure and won't feel like, oh, I'm being lectured to. Or again, someone comes from Ukraine and says, well, you know what, this is what's happening in Ukraine. And they say, well, I just heard that it was something totally different. So people are inclined to believe what they hear first. And even if you come along and say, it's not true and this is the reality, the first is the first, and that will stay with them. So it is unfortunate that Ukraine now finds itself in this position. We can't turn the clock back and change it and it become the first voice. But now that we are where we are, I think it's very important for the English language media and Ukrainians with English language skills as well, I would say. I'm sure that includes all of you, to put to put across the other side, the reality of Ukraine that is part of your life, your everyday lives. I mean, that would contradict a lot of the negative messages that are being put out about Ukraine. I think it would be quite interesting actually also to hear a little bit from you about what English language sources that you yourselves use in terms of media about Ukraine, and what you trust or what you would consider to be.
I would like to talk to you guys, yeah.
Reliable, as we've got quite an intimate group. Yeah, I mean, by all means. I mean, could I ask, perhaps, would you share what English language sources you would consider to be credible in their coverage of Ukraine?
I read The Guardian.
The Guardian?
Yeah, The Guardian.
Yeah.
And Kiev Post.
Kiev Post,
yeah. Do you like The Guardian? You like Sean Walker? Yeah.
Yes.
Sean Walker is a good journalist. Nice guy.
If I'd like to have the world important information, the first site is The Guardian.
Okay, Guardian, right? Very reputable. Sean Walker on Russia and Ukraine is a very sympathetic writer in every sense of sympathetic. He's sympathetic, and he's sympathetic to Ukraine. And I think that's a great first choice. You could do much worse. Anyone else read anything?
Please, ladies first.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, I think the Ukrainian Week is a very good publication, but I don't like the fact that there is like a Ukrainian prototype. So people opt for that, Ukrainsky Tydzień.
Yes.
Because it's like easier for them to read in Ukrainian than in English.
Yeah.
That's it.
Well, that would be very much for the audience here, but in terms of the international audience, it's also very, very important that it exists for them. They have the access to that.
Is it online, the Ukrainian Week? Yeah. All the stuff, all the pieces they put online.
I believe so. Yeah.
What about you? What about you?
Okay, so I read Business Ukraine for Dickinson's magazine.
He's
I
right here.
work, yes, for American Chamber of Commerce for the communications team, and we monthly prepare the newsletter.
Yes.
So it provides us with a lot of interesting information and
Great.
useful for our quotes, for our interviews, etc., and also keep post.
Keep post, yeah.
Definitely a very
You
good
work
magazine.
you work for Mr. Hunder.
Yes.
What about you? What do you read?
And I'm reading the Forbes.
Forbes, yeah.
I very like this magazine about business, economics, and political state. And I also like reading New York Times and the Time. There's a lot of great articles on that site.
Yeah, New York Times coverage of Ukraine has been spotty, but some of it has been good. They have a couple of good stringers who did good reporting from the East, and they've caught on to most of the trends, maybe 6 months or 6 months late, but I think they get it. New York Times is about. Wall Street Journal's coverage also has been not bad. The Wall Street Journal no longer has a correspondent in Ukraine, as far as I know. In fact, a lot of the correspondents, certainly a lot of the Americans, in fact, almost all of them have moved to Russia over the last year. I think for a lot of people, the story has shifted. So a lot of talented people like Oliver Carroll. Oliver Carroll was the Independence correspondent here, and he accepted the job of being the managing editor of the Moscow Times. So he's moved away from Kiev. Mr. Noah Schneider. Noah Schneider was a very good guy on Ukraine, and he accepted a job as the Economist's Moscow correspondent. So he's gone. BuzzFeed had a journalist with portfolio by the name of Max Sidon, my American compatriot. He also took a job with the Financial Times. He's now living in Moscow. Are you starting to see a pattern?
Well, I was just going to say, but bring sitting here with us, we have with Paul Nyland at the back here. Paul, nice to see you. The subject of Moscow correspondence is one we've touched on before.
We've written about it. You've published it, yeah.
Yeah, Paul has written an article on the subject that actually quite a talking point it provided. The basic idea that another area where Ukraine coverage suffers from, or where Ukraine doesn't receive perhaps its due, is the problem of international correspondents coming to cover Ukraine from Moscow.
Yeah.
So although they may well be people who have excellent credentials as
people like Andrew
Democrats.
Rolfe, people like Michael, the Washington Post does have a correspondent in Moscow, but they don't have anybody here.
Well, that's the norm, and I think that there are correspondents who come and go and base themselves in Kiev for a month or two, etc. But the ones who are generally doing the coverage are based in Moscow, and very often they will, even if people are here in Kiev, they will send their reports via Moscow. And I think it's a difficult thing to quantify, but there is a sense that someone who's living in Russia and who talks to Russians on a day-to-day basis will inevitably pick up some of the subconscious ideas, and a lot of them are going to be very negative. They will be, demeaning, or perhaps they will condescending towards Ukraine. So that's the
Ukrainian statehood. That's absolutely right.
Say, oh well, Ukraine is this, it's that, and then when they come here, they might find that the reality contradicts that to an extent. But again, that's the impression they came with, and everybody's human. Paul, maybe you could share a little bit of your experience of the feedback you got after that article that you wrote on this subject.
I've written a couple of articles on that particular subject, actually, and the first one was quite anonymous in that I didn't name the people who I felt, and the examples that I gave, specific examples of things that Moscow-based correspondents had said. One of which was a television correspondent, and then the other one was an editor-in-chief of a publication based in Moscow, who I just find to be just one of the most negative people, almost in every respect with regard to Ukraine. But then I wrote another piece of a follow-up piece because I read something that I felt deserved to be challenged, and I thought it was essential to have the conversation and to name names and to say this particular piece written by this particular person, and this is why I disagree. And I went into it in some depth. But with regard, you mentioned Sean. Sean Walker. I have a lot of respect for Sean.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Every now and then, I think he gets something wrong, as do we all, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, what did you just say? We're all human.
Sure.
Every now and then, I'll pick something up. The BBC's coverage, I thought it was quite astonishing that in the last couple of days with Savchenko, there was one BBC correspondent who used the word alleged before the 2 Russian soldiers that were returned. And I wrote to him and I said, why are you saying alleged? That's not only incorrect,
they admitted to it. Yeah, they admitted to it.
And then they admitted it, of course.
Right.
We know that they admitted it. And then a second BBC correspondent as well used quotation marks over the word soldiers. And they're tweeting this. And these are people who are responsible for informing. There was another BBC correspondent about 6 weeks ago, and again, I wrote this. In fact, I used it as the basis for an article that I wrote called False Equivalency, where the guy wrote to his 70-odd thousand Twitter followers, whatever it might be, this war is flaring up again as usual. We can only be left to guess why. I'm like, no, we can't be left to guess why. And you're supposed to be informing people. So there are issues that we have to address as the community of people that's responsible for informing, right? Whether we're informing people in Moscow or whatever. But one publication, and we've written for it, because I've written for them as well, that hasn't been mentioned here is the Atlantic Council.
Yeah,
Atlantic Council's Ukraine alerts, and Melinda Harding's a fabulous person to work with. She's brilliant. Right?
All 3 of us have written for it. Yeah,
exactly.
We've in fact we've co-authored a op-ed together with Melinda Herring at the Atlantic Council is a godsend. And,
she's great. She's great. The Atlantic Council itself is a good source. There's lots of good sources. There's lots of good writing actually in the Financial Times, and I've had various exchanges with different people.
And Mr. Olyarczyk is a great columnist and a great guy.
Rowan's great. I've known him for a number of years. Yeah, he's a strong guy.
There are people in Ukraine. There are people in Ukraine who are doing good journalism, who are hitting the streets and going out there and talking to people, and who have good intentions and have good instincts, and are very bright and pick up on a lot of things. There's not enough of them. The major newspapers, they do not have bureau chiefs or bureaus in Kiev.
Which is astonishing.
It's absolutely astonishing.
45 million people that doesn't warrant its own bureau chief. How is that possible?
It's absolutely, and here's an example that I personally have. I'm not going to mention my friend's name, but this person works for New York Times, and this person has a very major portfolio at the New York Times. And I asked her once, I was pitching her an idea about a friend of mine. I wanted her to write about a very interesting artist friend of mine who I wasn't, because he is my friend, I'm not going to be writing the profile myself. And I said, this is a great thing, and he's doing a lot of interesting things. And I think you should, you've already written a couple of things about this. You should come in and write about him. And she said to me, well, despite the fact that I have this title of a culture correspondent, when I write about Eastern Europe, Ukraine falls under the remit of the bureau chief of Moscow. So she says, I have to fight with them every time that I pitch a piece about Ukraine. I have to go get special permission from such and such an editor. And obviously this guy just doesn't like it when I go over his head and I write a piece outside of his remit. So those pieces don't get written, and that person stays in, whoever that editor is in Moscow, he stays there.
Oh yeah, I mean this is an on-running theme, and Ukraine is the victim of the situation, whereas we have to ask, well, where does this come about from? I mean, this is the way it used to be done, and I can imagine in the early 1990s when these things were being set up, that was the assumption. Okay, well, Moscow will cover this former Soviet region, and that will be the way it works. And I'm advised that it's the same for most countries in the region. So they don't have, there's not bureaus in the Baltics or even the Caucasus either. Everything goes via Moscow. But having said that, of course, if you're in Warsaw or Eastern or Prague or Budapest, they would have their own platform. So it's not the whole behind the Iron Curtain. It is an issue, and if you wanted to pick out any country from within the Soviet sphere which is deserving of its own correspondent corps, it would certainly be Kiev in my mind, certainly Ukraine, and that would be the logical choice. Maybe we'll get there in the coming years, and I think if things develop along the current trajectories, I think they'll come to the point where they will see that it is actually unworkable. I think that it's from the view from Kiev is that it is a farce to have Moscow correspondents writing about Kiev at a time when Russia and Ukraine are involved in a conflict.
There's not even direct flights. It's amazing how we even
Well,
get
that
here.
as well, but I mean that's more of a logistical issue perhaps. But
How do you
think,
even get here? I mean, you have to go through Belarus to get here. It's
well, I mean that's probably a little bit more of a even more current an issue. Jim Brooks joins us now.
Yeah.
Jim, you've been a Moscow bureau chief.
Yeah.
Maybe you could share your experience of the
Yeah.
just debating the rationale.
Great crowd we have here in the middle of a rainstorm. Thank you for guys coming.
Well, yeah.
Debating the
Peter
rationale
and
of
Vladislav, thank you. I was the Moscow bureau chief for Voice of America and for Bloomberg, and that was, I don't know, 2006, 2014. And of course, there were direct flights, and Bloomberg has a very active bureau here. The same bureau chief when I was there, Dasha Krasilutskaya. Bloomberg really relies on reporting on the ground, and Voice of America does too. They have a several correspondents here, and as you know, Reda Svoboda has a bureau, and I would generally defer to the people on the ground here because I knew what was going on. As soon as they cut the direct flights, I knew that the coverage by the Moscow correspondents would drop sharply.
Yep.
And I know Andy Kramer of the New York Times was here a few weeks ago, but I think you'll just see that it'll be these big production trips. I mean, it used to be I could leave the VOA bureau and be here. I'd take the express train to Domodedovo, take the Transiera to Giuliani, and I'd be here in Kyiv
3 hours.
Or Odessa. There were direct flights to Odessa. Yeah, I mean, it's very quick and painless and cheap. Now it's not quick and it's painful. Anyone who's been through Minsk airport knows it's painful, or Riga. So I think obviously the coverage would deteriorate. On the other hand, if things like the Odessa Review can prosper, you're getting more of a Ukraine point of view, a Ukraine-centric point of view. I have a question for you guys, and I brought you your competitor, the Mekong Review.
Oh, great! Thank you.
Straight from Cambodia.
Thank you.
See, this is.
Thank you so much.
They see everybody. This is a quarterly, and this is a monthly. My question to both of you guys, and Peter, how can you keep up the quality? Because I read every single article in Mekong Review. Yeah. I read most of the articles in your first edition.
And how are we stacking up?
Well, good. I mean, obviously, much better printing. I mean, you got color pictures and better quality. But this is a heck of a lot of work every month. I have to tell you.
That's true. Yeah.
I mean, do you think that it might be better to go quarterly and more?
Well, technically, we're not quite a monthly. We're 9-10 month issues. We're a year. So I mean, in the late winter and the early spring, we have a double issue in order to take some of the steam off. That is a great question. A couple of people told me to do it bi-monthly. It's not out of the question that we will have to switch to a bi-monthly issue. At the moment, I think monthly is great. I think that this is what this country needs. I think this is what Odessa needs. There's so much material. There's so much stuff that I want to write about. There's so much going on with Saakashvili being the governor. I mean, I know so much about all that's going on, and I probably know 15 to 20% what's actually happening, because there's so much deal making. There's so much. Just look at what's been going on in the last 24 hours in Odessa. I'll just tell you what's happened in the last 24 hours. There was an armed raid on his office. He ran in through the cordon like a maniac, or probably a principled patriot who knew that he could get away with it. After that, there was a presser where he made accusations, and this was in fact because of Sean Walker's piece. Allegedly, Sean Walker, my friend Sean Walker, came in a week and a half ago. 2 weeks ago, I saw him at breakfast. Then he went off to see Saakashvili. He took an interview with Saakashvili. Saakashvili, perhaps ill-advisedly, said that the new government was full of mediocrities or something like that. It was either mediocrities or non-entities or...
Mediocrity.
Did he say mediocrities?
That was the translation.
Yeah, mediocre.
Well, he said it in English. I think.
He said it mediocre, and then allegedly he denied it. And Sean Walker went on Twitter last night to say, well, he did say it. I have the audio. And after Sean's piece came out in the Guardian, with Governor Saakashvili, who's obviously very dependent and codependent and interdependent in a way we don't even know how it plays out and what the actual details of that relationship with Poroshenko are. Obviously, he attacked the government, and Sean publishes this piece, and coincidentally, there are armed men in his office looking for incriminating evidence or documents or whatever a few hours later, and there's a presser, there's accusations, there's counter accusations, and this morning we have an entire little kerfuffle over the concurrent renaming of streets because of a decommunization process. So I don't know if anyone knows about this, but in the middle of Odessa, 70 streets are to be renamed. 70 streets are to be renamed. These are not minor streets. This is like again, what was the main street that they wanted? Sad Pobeda, or what did they want to rename? They renamed to Nебесная Hanna. Yeah, Marshal Zhukov, which is one of the main arteries in the city, is named after obviously the marshal who won World War II and lived in Odessa for 2 years after the war. So Saakashvili, as governor, signs the order of renaming this main artery. And half a day later, we have an entire scandal because at least 10 of those cities, street names that they wanted to rename, are Ukrainian patriots or completely, silly that they're getting rid of someone who is not just a communist, but also someone who contributed something to the culture. And in fact, the most ridiculous thing is Belensky. Vizarion Bilitsky, yeah, great Russian literary critic, socialist, 1880s guy who dies way before the Russian Revolution. So Belinsky Street was renamed, and Belinsky is of course a great figure in Russian literature and one of the founders of Russian literary criticism. So this is a kind of an act of Philistinism to rename a street. And it comes out this morning that I think Mr. Zmak, Saakashvili's aide, said that actually they confused it. It was never Belitsky, who was a Civil War fighter, 1917, 1918. So it's a major scandal in some ways. This is an attack, or if not an attack, or misunderstanding of historical characteristics of a city. So this is history in the making, and they're getting it wrong. Someone made a mistake. Either
it's probably a human factor. I mean, maybe someone just simply made the mistake. Although of course it will be,
Yeah, but this is
portrayed as an attack on the identity of the city, perhaps by some. But I think this is a good example where it's very important to have guys
people
on the ground like
yeah.
yourself who can report this, rather than having someone in again Moscow or wherever, or in the West, who reports it in a very general sense of like the controversy of Ukraine's de-Sovietization, whereas
no one will report this. If I don't,
it might become a line in a bigger piece somewhere.
Yeah.
But again, if someone on the ground in Odessa is able to produce a definitive account explaining attitudes to these individual personalities, then when the journalist from France or Spain or wherever,
Germany,
comes to write their story about de-Sovietization, there's a very good chance they'll find that story, read it, and then be able to add add value to their article, rather than just picking up on the very broad strokes, which don't often give the reality. Well, that's the reality, but up until recently, and to an extent now, it's still, there's not, these sources don't exist. So if you go online and you look, now I've lived in many years, I can get by in Russian, less so in Ukrainian, but I can manage. But even so, for me, reading in Russian and Ukrainian is not a very comfortable experience. and certainly searching on the internet and looking through is a very uncomfortable experience for me. Unfortunately, that's embarrassing in a sense, given I've lived here so long, but that's the reality. And frankly speaking, most foreigners, most English-speaking foreigners are even worse. Without wanting to be, I think it's quite normal for English speakers wherever we live in the world to have a limited scope for the local language because we speak English. Because we have the advantages of speaking a language that most local people will know a little bit of and will want to know more of. And there's always someone around who speaks English. So it is an issue for us, and we do, journalists, I'm sure, if it's the case in English, it's certainly the case it would be in French and German, that if you wanted to write about these subjects, you wouldn't be able to find much on them. So you would be limited to your sources. And
there's a feedback loop, actually. This causes a feedback loop. So people write a piece, and then someone else catches on to it, and it becomes a kind of cliched feedback loop of information that's available in the Anglophones or even the Francophone space. And in fact, my wife and I lived in Paris before we came back to Odessa to start this magazine. The French are even worse. I mean, the Germans and the French have much less in terms of resources on the ground, and I think they rely on us, the English-speaking journalists, to do a lot of the footwork. I don't have the figures because they don't exist, but I imagine there's 10 times fewer correspondents in Ukraine and Russia in French and German and Spanish media. They're just not there.
yeah,
And they rely on us. Yeah,
Sorry,
go ahead,
Peter,
please.
uh, two quick questions.
Sure.
I see you've got your little magnifying glass. So are most of these stories searchable? So
Yeah.
a correspondent comes in and wants to know about Mark Twain, but he comes in August. Can he get the cover story easily?
Yeah, 90% of what is so far, 70% of the stuff online. We do have content which is, some of the content I write, some of the content other journalists write is in the magazine. So 95% of what's in the magazine is online, and 70% of what is online is also in the magazine.
I think the question is, will it stay there? The non-time sensitive material will remain online as available.
Yeah.
Is it searchable or is it an archive?
Yeah. It's being archived. Not the events though. The events that they have the event section that has a half-life of a fruit fly. Life of a fruit fly. So we do get rid of the events. We're very good on events. Actually, maybe Regan, would you show the event section? Where someone can someone just maybe go through the event section and show some tweets.
Well, that's happening. Quick second question.
Yeah, go
I mean, in terms of critical mass of people who are comfortable reading English,
It's a great question. Yeah, we think about that a lot.
I mean, like, does Misha, your governor, read this?
We've taken pictures of it. He's taken pictures of him standing like this with the thing. He knows it exists. He knows who I am.
Yeah.
I interviewed him 3 times. We are in friendly relations with his staff.
Yeah.
We do not have a position. Let's just answer all those questions together. That's the next question anyway. So let's preempt it. We do not have a political position in terms of the Mayor Trukhanov Governor Saakashvili fight. We do not have a position other than the fact that sometimes Mayor Trukhanov does great things to the city. When he does, we support him. Obviously, there are a lot of allegations of other stuff. We don't touch it in terms of investigative reporting. We are not a political magazine. We have a very good policy and politics columnist in the name of Mr. Nick Homov. We are not doing investigative journalism. There are other people who are good at that. I cannot compete with Dumskaya. I cannot compete with someone like Sergei Zegrov, who's a great writer for Dumskaya. Does pieces for me. I'm not in the business of in-depth investigative journalism of the corruption and the criminal stuff that goes on. There's so much of it, and that's for you. That's for people to do in Russian and Ukrainian locally. So go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I know Peter fights a good fight with the Lviv magazine, and I mean, Peter, do you get that magazine to Kyiv at all? And subset, are you trying to get this? You've got a lot here tonight, but generally, is this available, and where is it available in Kyiv.
Yeah, well, we're setting up a we're going to set up a distribution network here. We already have it in 4 or 5 places. We had lunch at the Harms Cafe today, and during lunch we got one more place, and that's the way it's going to be. It's going to be piecemeal in Kiev, but you're going to be able to get it if you want it in Kiev. I wanted to get back to your question of critical mass of readership. It's a very important question. More and more of the young people do speak English. More and more young people do speak English. That's very important. I think for a lot of them, we've had at least 4 people come up to us and say, you know, my English is rusty, or I've been learning English, but now I really have a reason to pick up the dictionary and the Slovati and the thesaurus, and to go through this and work on my English. There's a lot of people I think who are going to be using this, because it's not so much, if you're living in Odessa, there's not so much English language stuff that you can find. There are 3 or 4 bookstores where you can go and find English language books. They are expensive. They're just denominated in hryvnia, from the dollars or the euros or the pounds. Basically, if you want to read something in English, it's the Kiev
So where
Post.
would this be in Kyiv? At the Yo bookstore? Or
So in the back we have listings. We have a listing section. And on the side also the Hilton Hotel, the Odessa restaurant, the Arbikenya. There is an Odessa restaurant. We thought it was very important for symbolic reasons that the Odessa restaurant be the first place that we agreed to. So we are setting up right now, even as we speak, a subscription model. I would love to have people subscribe to this. You will be able to get this in your house the way that the Kiev Post sends their newspaper to people all over Ukraine and all over the world. We are going to have a subscription service, and I think it's very important that people be able to get this in the States. There's a massive Odessa community, Odessan. By the way, the Odessite decision was very important in terms of orthography, and terminology is exquisitely important. So Peter understands very well that terminology is important, because he was one of the first people who got the Russia-backed pro-Russia distinction going in the West. Oh, please.
Yeah, that was well. That's, I think, words are powerful. Phraseology is crucial. Like, coming back to
Absolutely.
We were saying earlier, Paul, about the BBC. I think that the most striking thing for me, apart from the what they call the scare speech marks, whatever, or the alleged, the use of the term civil war, which the BBC has done quite liberally. Yes, to the extent where it's gone beyond the point where I can sort of write it off as a mistake or an individual opinion of an individual author. I think it's clearly must be their editorial policy, which is frankly shocking. I think one of the problems that a lot of the Ukrainians encountered, again coming back to the idea of getting Ukraine's message across, was what do we call these people in East Ukraine? Okay, so we have this hybrid war which is designed to confuse. We have a strategy which is designed to mask and to conceal, and the Western media was clearly very unsure of how to handle this approach. In Crimea we saw it, where again they were very liberal with the use of terms like allegedly, and they say this, they say that, and just basically washing their hands of the situation, saying we're not going to make a judgment call because it's not our job to do that. We're just going to say they say they're Russians, they say they're not. We don't know, and basically washing their hands.
That plays into the Russian narrative.
Yeah, which is exactly the result that the Kremlin was counting on and got. It was a huge victory for the Russian side in that instance, and then in East Ukraine the situation continued, and we have this situation. What do you call these people? What do we call these forces? Okay, there's some locals there. We know that they are armed by Russians. That there are large numbers of Russian so-called volunteers or holiday-making soldiers. I mean, it's farcical when you look at it in the cold light of day. But
can I comment on this?
Yes, please.
With regard to the BBC using the term civil war wrongly, there was a letter that was written to them, signed by a bunch of Ukrainian MPs about 10 days ago, which hopefully will get them to stop doing that. And it's been used in the most innocuous ways as well. There was a program about great women, and they were looking at the Dalia I can't pronounce the surname, the president of.
Grubauskaite,
That's the one, yeah. And so there was a program about strong women, and I think it was Michelle Hussein who used the term civil war when talking about her.
Yeah.
You know, and it was astonishing. So hopefully that's addressed. What term to use? I've seen in the last 3 or 4 months, and shifts in language is very, very important, and the shifts in diplomatic language are sometimes too slow.
Yeah.
But both Jeff Pyatt, the American ambassador to Ukraine, and Daniel Baer, the American ambassador to the OSCE, have started adopting using the term Russian-led.
Yes.
Which is
good.
Not Russian-backed anymore, not Russian-directed, but Russian-led.
That's nice, because
that's very significant.
Yeah, they began using the term. There was I think it was a few months ago now. The American, I guess it was a policy decision. They began talking about combined Russian separatist forces, which is a bit of a mouthful. It sounds a bit. It's not very snappy. Although I can understand what they were trying to do. I'm toying with the idea now. I think it's a valid term of using the term hybrid Russian forces.
I think in terms of Russian-led, I mean, the information has come out within the last 6 weeks that there really are Russian officers commanding each unit, and in the civilian control. That wasn't quite so clear, or may not have been fully in place.
May not have been implemented until very recently.
Oh, my understanding is that they've been the higher up you go in the hierarchies have been Russian people from very, very early on, arguably from before day one. But yeah, in terms of what we know and the fog of war, I think it's becoming a lot clearer. And you're referring to the Bild report about the shadow cabinet in Moscow, and
Well, there are two actually. One's about the shadow cabinet in Moscow that's running the civilian infrastructure. But then there's also a report as well of the naming the specific Russian generals that are actually giving the orders on the ground in eastern Ukraine. So I mean, we know both of those sides are being implemented to de facto try and create a
to take it back a couple of steps. So when the conflict in East Ukraine began, the terminology. Again, I said the conflict in East Ukraine. We said the Russian invasion of East Ukraine. Well, is it really an invasion? Again, it's another linguistic conundrum. But when the conflict began, the initial coverage in the Western media tended to use terminology like pro-Russian, which implies they're locals who are pro-Russian. So it's or even
means that they have some legitimacy.
Well, it implies a lot of legitimacy. I would say it legitimizes.
If you respect their agency, they can.
Well, they be pro-Russian.
They're allowed to think what they like.
This is absolutely in line with the Kremlin position. And this is or also even Ukrainian rebels, or Ukrainian separatists, or anti-Kiev. That was another very popular thing that the Russian media pushed very hard. This idea of saying there's Kiev and there's Donetsk, there's Donbass and there's Kiev. There's no Ukraine. They wouldn't say, they're the Ukrainian forces. They said, well, they're Ukrainians too. See, so these linguistic tricks make huge difference. And one of the things that I did in my publications and at Ukraine Today, when we launched them prior to that in other media work I'd done, we very much used the terminology Russia-backed, and promoted this phrase and used it very consistently, and we found that very quickly Kiev Post began using it as well, which I think was a huge step, because they have a very broad reach and a very credible reputation. And very soon, and certainly to now, I think that terminology, although it might feel like a small thing, but now Russia-backed has become the sort of default position for most Western media. They tend to use this terminology. It wasn't the case before. So that is actually a very, very specific example where we were able to push back a little bit and create a more, from our perspective, a more realistic impression, but certainly from a Ukrainian perspective, to defend the country's image position or the country's informational security, and to push back against this Russian disinformation. So now the next Russian-led. Okay, that fits. That the shoe fits there, certainly. But I think certainly it reflects journalists are to an extent pack animals. They will follow each other, and if they're not expert, they will look to see what other people are saying.
Well, there's just not enough time. Even like a guy like Sean Walker who comes in, he relies on someone like me who lives there. And
No, they'll tap into it. You know, why does, you know,
It
this
doesn't repeat what
it's still proverbial, but you know, journalists will very often quote taxi drivers because they go somewhere and they talk to the taxi driver and they get this great information from him.
It's the biggest cliche in
It's
journalism.
a cliche, but it's, you know, you see it happen to this day. And on that point, I conducted an interview some time ago with one of the leading correspondents from Canada, who was in Crimea at the time of the takeover. Macintosh. I think very interesting gentleman. He had previously been in the North Caucasus and Chechnya and had personal first-hand experience of Russian forces, of the uniforms they wore, of the weaponry they carried, of the transport they drove, the markings they had. You know, he was familiar with them on a you know, he didn't know the individual people, but he knew the divisions, the battalions, the structures, and he saw them in Crimea, and he knew that they were Russian. Mm-hmm. And he wrote about this, and his editors in Canada said to him, "Is anyone else saying this?" And he said, "Well, no, they're not." He said, "Well, we weren't either." Yeah. And he had to take that. You know, he said, "Well, I know." He said, "But you may know. No one else is saying this. We don't want it to be the international scandal. Canada says this. No one else says it. Or, you know, this particular brand in Canada." So journalists are in a very powerful position in that sense, but they that power also encourages a sort of conservative attitude and a group thinking.
Was that the Globe and Mail or the National Post?
I don't want to put the guy on the spot too much. Actually, no, he did say it in an interview. It was the Globe and Mail.
Yeah, because the National Post is quite. Used to be quite.
But I think you know there will be exceptions, but I think in many cases the journalistic default position will be to say, what is everyone else saying? What are they doing? How far do we want to break ranks from the pack? And if we want to take a position that is outside of the sort of consensus, then we better be damn sure about it. We can't say, well, I think, or I'm almost sure. You've got to be damn sure.
Can I come back actually, going back to the identity of the people that are fighting against Ukraine?
Yes.
Because that's essentially what it is. They're people fighting against Ukraine.
Yeah.
You, in Business Ukraine magazine, you did a fantastic interview with a Polish guy who was a former OSCE observer. And he said in that interview that it was not until MH17 that most of the OSCE observation mission understood themselves the full extent of Russian involvement in the armed forces fighting against Ukraine. But recently, about 4 weeks ago, I was speaking with someone who is with the OSCE. And he was telling me that out there now, almost all of the people that they come across are Russian passport holders, and they don't hide it. And their argument and the way that they justify their presence on Ukrainian territory is, if they hadn't come, then the DNR or the LNR, and they need quote marks as well, but entities
they probably do justify quote marks,
right? Those entities would have failed. And they just don't get it into their head that, yes, those entities would have failed because there wasn't sufficient will amongst the actual local population.
There were not enough young men who were willing to pick up guns.
Exactly.
That's why they had to send in Russian special forces and then the Russian army in the first place.
And a significant part of the tactic that we've seen as well, actually, is destroying the industry infrastructure so that there's no jobs, and then the only thing that some locals can do now is to be paid to pick up a gun. But can I, if you don't mind, with your permission, bring this back to actually talking about Odessa?
Yeah, I wanted to get back to Odessa also. Yeah.
So I read a fantastic piece today by Timothy Snyder in the New York Times Review of Books.
Right. And Timothy Snyder, by the way, has committed to writing for the Odessa Review.
Has he really?
He wrote me a little nice thing. He said, "Let's talk about it." But he has on Facebook chat with me. Committed to writing for the Odessa Review. Yeah, just let's get that out there.
The article that was published today, again, it's the New York Times Review of Books, and so he actually reviewed 3 different books together and wove them into one piece.
Which is, what are the books?
The Wars of Vladimir Putin. The title of the article is The Wars of Vladimir Putin.
Right.
That's very interesting. But where specifically he talks about Odessa, he's talking about how the different major capitals of the oblast that Putin targeted as Novorossiya, this other entity that failed completely. Right. But one of them obviously is Odessa, and what he says is, cosmopolitan Odessa excelled in mockery of Putin. That's his line, and that's something I think that's very unique to the Odessa spirit is the humor, the satire, the mockery, the way that people from Odessa approach whatever problem it is and just come up with something humorous to say about it.
Thanks for reminding us. That's absolutely right. Yeah. Novorossiya did fail, and Odessa would have been I mean, and there's still occasional attempts to get the situation little
It's a
heated.
destabilization tool rather than an actual like breakthrough.
Yeah. We had a terrorism campaign. I mean, no one wrote about this. I mean, I wrote about it, and Anna Nemtsova wrote about it. We had like 37 bombings in the scale of 10 months.
37 bombings.
Yeah, we had 37. I mean, these are, they were doing it 3, 4 in the morning, but
It was a regular occurrence for a period.
I heard 3 myself personally. I heard 3 bombs myself.
When was
What?
that? When?
From December of 2014 to September 27th, when the SBU building was blown up, and you heard. Did anyone hear about this in the West?
Well, it
Did
was not major news. I think it was usually referred to as a line, like there have been
The
bombings.
SBU building was blown up in the middle of almost broad daylight in the evening. The SBU building had a explosion, a major explosion, and I mean, you didn't see this much anywhere.
It wasn't major. It certainly wasn't international news.
It was not international news. The SBU building in the middle of Odessa was blown up, and this was not international news. So from December of 2014 to September of 2015, when the SBU building was blown up, we had dozens and dozens of bombings. So some of them, I went to see the police spokeswoman, who was also, she was involved in a minor scandal later when it turned out she was a call girl or something like that. This was the international scandal. More people found out about the fact that this good-looking spokesgirl that I talked to was a stripper than actually knew about the fact that she was telling me that they had 12 at that time already at 12 bombings, which were characterized as bombings, because a lot of the bombings were characterized as vandalism because of the technicalities of the law. Look, we had a terrorism campaign, and nobody heard about this. This is amazing. Isn't that remarkable? We had 37 bombings in 10 months, with most of them being targets of opportunity and banks and self-defense organizations. We had a terrorism campaign, and nobody in the West found out about it, except Anna Nemtsova. I heard about it. Sorry?
Volunteers offices.
Yes.
Yeah, the volunteers offices.
If I can just change tacks a little bit, we don't have a lot of time left, but as we have Ukrainian guests with us, I'd very much like to pick your brains a little bit, if I may, and ask you also, from your point of view, so English language media in Ukraine, the Odessa Review, or any media, I mean, obviously you have access to all the local media and other international media. What would be of interest? What sort of things do you tend to read in English language media here? Do you use them as a news source, or are you interested in opinion pieces, or are you looking to get the foreign perspective on issues that you're local issues that you're already familiar with? What would be the things that would most attract your attention generally? Because I think just coming back to what Jim said earlier, I mean, it is an interesting question of how many foreign readers there are, even in Kiev. I think it's a difficult question, but it's certainly, I would imagine there's fewer foreigners than there are issues. So in terms of the magazines I publish in Kiev and Lviv and also in Odessa, I think there's almost certainly fewer foreigners in the cities, the English speakers, than there are copies of the magazine. So it's an assumption that a large number of Ukrainians will be amongst our readers. So it'll be very interesting to hear what type of thematics, what type of stories or content you generally read in these sort of publications. Could I ask for your feedback on that?
The main topics for me is international news, the main international news, and news about Ukraine, especially Russian-Ukraine situation, and finance and economic information, because I work in this area.
You work in finance, yeah?
Yes.
Sure.
Well, I wanted to start with a little bit of intro first.
Okay, yes.
I studied publishing and editing, and for me, it's really personal when it comes to Ukrainian publications, because I can see how terrible the situation is, and I can't name many publications that are Ukrainian and are good quality. So I had a quick glance inside, and I actually really appreciate the quality of this piece, the layout, the illustrations. It's really great, and I'm really happy to just hold it.
Thank you.
All
We're
right.
really
Very
concerned
happy
with
to hear it,
aesthetics.
yeah.
We're really concerned with aesthetics. Thank you so much for saying that.
And
We're very glad you see that, because that's a really important thing for us.
thanks for doing that, actually. I have quite a different view, because I'm not really keen on economics or politics or anything like that. I'm more into culture, style, and I've seen like a post about a designer, fashion designer. That really interests me, in fact. And my question is, can people, citizens, actually contribute to the magazine?
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, you're hired. Yeah. I mean, I'm joking, but in fact, if you'd
But
like
not.
to, I'm not
No,
joking at all.
why
Actually,
not?
we had a presentation at the Odessa hub, and it's true that 70% of the stuff, if you look at it, for the first 2 issues, it was written either by 19th century dead white guys, or it was written by people. It was written by me, or interviews with someone. Or it was written by people that I know, or people that we know through the grapevine or through the profession. I'll just go through this. It's a good time to talk about what's actually in the thing, and we'll transition back to your question. So Boris Hersonsky, the most famous poet in Ukraine, in the Russian language, and certainly the most famous poet of Odessa. He writes a monthly column, Odessa Talk with Boris Hersonsky, about the Odessa intelligentsia. In fact, that's Regina. That's my wife as the Odessa intelligentsia illustrated. I grew up with Hersonsky's niece, who's a great novelist in New York, and so he's a family friend, and he was quite keen to join. So we have Boris Hersonsky. So we have the heavy hitters of an older generation. He's older than 60. He's also a very famous psychiatrist. Then we have, also by coincidence, one of my college professors is the main academic who works on Odessa humor. Maybe not a coincidence. Maybe I've been preparing for this job my entire life. So this was my college professor at Hunter College at City University in New York 10 years ago. And he wrote 4 books about Odessa humor and Russian humor. And his most recent book is Kudziska Guru, From Here to Whatever, a novel of Odessa. Before that, he wrote To Laugh or Not to Laugh. My professor, Mr. Emil Dreitzer, is the leading academic monger of turning Odessa humor into a completely unreadable academic prose. But he wrote a wonderful essay on the linguistic structures of Odessa humor. So this is a guy I knew who was my professor in college. This is a gentleman that we met who is a name of Dmitry Sikorsky. He wrote a wonderful piece on the secret of Bessarabian cuisine. So this is a gentleman that we met through the scene. Once we started going out and about and getting the magazine out there, we met this gentleman who's an expert on brinza cheese, an exporter and importer of brinza cheese. And so this is a guy who can speak for hours about the beauty of 7% salt brinza cheese opposed to 9% salt brinza cheese.
Can't we all?
Yeah, can't we all? Now we can, because we have a piece about this. And so he is a restaurateur, and he is an expert on Bessarabian cuisine. So he wrote a piece for us. And that's the kind of thing I want as locals to write for us. This is Mr. Ivan Luptuga, who is the son of the she's the director of the Odessa Literary Museum, and her son is a major tourism guy, and he's now actually working in the Ministry of Economic Development and Trade. And before this, he was the director of tourism and resorts for the Odessa Tourism Association. So he's the biggest guy on Odessa tourism. He's a local who actually moved up to Kiev to do this professionally after the Maidan, and he gave us a nice interview. This is a journalist that I know from the diaspora circles. He's a Canadian American Ukrainian. This is exactly the kind of a guy you'd expect to be writing for us on economic stuff. Mr. Christopher Izajawi. Then we have a local contributor from the European Business Association, the EBA, gives us stuff which is of very high quality in terms of business stuff. They're locals. I do have 2 staff journalists for me who are locals, and I'm looking for more local young people to come work for me in terms of internships and practicing young journalists who I'm going to give work to. We have a young woman by the name of Yulia Monikova, who writes a monthly fashion column. So there's a lot of young women who are very big in fashion, including our acquaintance Yulia Pascal, who is the first Ukrainian to have her stuff be featured at Ukrainian at the Paris Fashion Week. So Julia Pascal is now one of the three most famous Ukrainian designers in the country, and she's broken out into the wider world. And she coincidentally sublets my apartment whenever she's in Paris. I have an apartment in Paris. She sublets my apartment in Paris. That's not why we have her in here. She was famous before she sublet my apartment in Paris, but she does sublet my apartment in Paris. So all these things feed into each other, and a lot of these people know each other, and
It's a small world.
it's a small world, but it's very organic also. And for only 30% of the stuff that is in here was written by locals, but I'd like it to be 60%. I'd like it to be 70% in the future. My wife Regina has a column about film. She has a PhD in film theory from Paris Sorbonne Paris 8. So she has a film column. We're very strong on literature, exceedingly strong on literature, because I studied literature and I love literature, and a lot of people want to write about Odessa literature because it's a great city in the history of literature. We have a column now. We have not a column, but a portfolio in this issue about 19th century travelers in Ukraine. So we have Mickiewicz, we have Oliphant, a British traveler from the 19th century who was a member of Parliament. We have my friend, the great American Canadian writer Soren Golger, who's a novelist who lives in Krakow. He wrote a wonderful piece about Oliphant. He was just coincidentally reading the Odessa memoirs of a 19th century British traveler, and he contributed a piece. Then we have excerpts from Mark Twain's travels in Odessa. Then we have an essay unmarked about Odessa travelers. We have a very famous but very reclusive Parisian, Italy-born novelist by the name Hannah Halgavani, who wrote 3 very well-received novels in German. She's from the German-speaking part of Italy. She lives in Paris, and she has a particular interest in the German writers of Odessa. It's very specific, and that's a niche market, but that's exactly what I want. I mean, I may be the only person in the world who knows this reclusive Jewish German girl with an Italian passport who lives in Paris, who's obsessed with the German writers in Odessa in the 19th century. That's great stuff. We happen to know her. She wrote this piece for us happily, and you will never see this anywhere except the Odessa Review. The history of German literature in Odessa. It's very particular. It's very esoteric, but it's there. It exists, and I think there's a real market for this in the world. I think there's a real market for this in the English-speaking world to find out about this. The other guy I have is a young guy by the name of Vadim Golopyorov, who's a really, really talented local journalist, and he also writes monthly for me. This month he has a piece about the Wolfman of Odessa, Sigmund Freud's most famous analysis. And is it analysis? Patient. Thank you. Yeah.
I guess.
Patient was from Odessa, a Russian aristocrat from Odessa, the Wolfman.
He thought he was a wolf.
He thought he was a wolf, but he was actually an Odessan. We have Ute Kilter, who's a very well-known art critic, and she's also a friend, writing a column for us about art and the history of art in Odessa. And there is a really remarkable, very interesting history of art, and a very remarkable contemporary art scene, not as remarkable as it was in the 60s and the 30s and the 20s and the 1890s, but still we have a really interesting art scene, which is a satellite of the Kiev art scene that we have a mandate to write about. We have a interview with Mr. Boris Loshkin, who no one has ever heard of, no one will ever hear of again. We have I think it's a joke. He's the head of a presidential administration of Ukraine. So Mr. Boris Loshkin, we have an interview with him. It's very interesting. He doesn't say very much because he can't, but we do have an interview with him. Mr. Nick Homolf, who is the founder of the Odessa blog, and perhaps the best known political writer on Odessa Life, a British gentleman, a Brit. Mm-hmm. A very well-known political analyst. He writes a political column. We have him, and we have 2 long essays on very famous French philosopher by the name of Michel Onfray came to Odessa last month, and he said a lot of nonsense. So I wrote a three-page essay eviscerating his position. That's a pet peeve. I hate this man. So I have my own magazine. I'm going to write 2,500 word essay explaining why he is a horrible human being who doesn't understand anything. Now you understand.
If I just interrupt you there briefly, but yeah, we're running out of time now. So if
we can talk for 5
we can talk 5 minutes, certainly, yeah. But I would very much like to get your feedback.
But just before we do that,
I
I would love for you to come to Odessa and be an intern or a trainee in my office. And if you are willing to relocate, I'd be happy to have you.
As I understand, you have some representatives in Kyiv, right? So I can connect with them.
Yeah, we can
definitely
I
talk
can
about
also draw a little bit, so I can illustrate.
Great.
If
Yeah,
you
we already
need-
have 3 illustrators, but we can look at your stuff, and I'd be happy to have many more young people. I don't just want Simon Sebag Montefiore writing op-eds about how cool Odessa is. As cool as that is, we do have in the first issue. Where is it? Where's the first issue? Actually,
this is what I wanted to ask. Say, from the
Yeah.
point of view of the Ukrainian readers,
Yeah.
you know, what would be interesting for you to read in the English language about Odessa? Foreign perspectives on today's Odessa, or
yeah, Simon
Historical-
Sebag Montefiore is cool, but I want young people to write for me. So please.
please, do you have any not necessarily suggestions, but just general themes or ideas that you'd be interested in reading more about, or what is it that interests you? Perhaps maybe at the back. Yes, please.
Probably remarkable Odessa young people.
Young
people who have
Odessans.
succeeded, yes.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
In their lives in entrepreneurship, somebody who have launched the startups and found success in Ukraine or abroad. Sometimes that would be definitely interesting. Also
There's
about
a lot of them.
There's so many of them. Yeah.
not young, I mean also like middle-aged people who are successful in Odessa and who are driving Ukraine forward.
It's a great idea.
Definitely interesting for us because we are constantly looking for success stories of Ukraine. In our organization, we
Yes.
get asked by international media, like, is Ukraine really moving forward or is it stuck? So we would really appreciate that kind of information.
It needs success stories. It needs validation. Absolutely. There's the issue of brain drain. This is maybe an uncomfortable issue, but I mean I think this is an open forum, and we're not here to talk in platitudes. We're here to explain interesting things to people. Honestly, there is an issue of brain drain. Some of the best people in Ukraine are leaving. Some of the best people are building businesses, and we have a rejuvenated civil society that we haven't had anything like in 25, 27 years. But a lot of the best people are leaving. So we personally know 4 or 5 of our friends have left Odessa in the last 2 years. Is that right, Regina? We know a lot of people who are leaving. So that's not pleasant. That's not great. Some of those people do come back. Some of them do not. Odessa, again, I've said, was always a launching pad for smart people to do something and then go somewhere else. I can give names. You don't need to.
I think the idea of success stories, aspirational stories, is very important. In my other media as well, it's something I'm often aware of. If I see a Ukrainian has won an award internationally, I will always try to find them and do some sort of coverage of that. Purely from that point of view, I think it's very important for people to see. It's important for Ukrainians to see that such things occur and such things are possible, and also important for the outside world to see Ukraine in that context as a world-class country that is succeeding against the best that the rest of the world has to offer.
Right.
That they're winning awards, that they're getting recognition. I think that's valid. I think Ukrainian. I would like to see the Ukrainian media do more of that. Frankly, I find it can be frustrating sometimes when they don't do enough of that in Ukraine. Sometimes there are success stories, and the people will say to me, Ukrainian media didn't really take much of an interest in this, and they're very happy to speak about it, and they usually say, it's great that you're doing it. So yeah, that's good that I'm doing it. I'm happy to do it, but it would be nice to think that you are being also, focused on by Ukrainian media. So
this feeds into it. I mean, like Julia Pascal will now be on the. She was a little bit already on the scene anyway, but you're giving a heads up to people who are lazy and they don't live here. They don't know who the famous young Odessa designers are. There's so many...
We can't expect people to know outside and people who are not connected to Ukraine to take a huge interest in Ukraine. They won't. It's not realistic, and that's not because they don't like Ukraine. They don't take an interest in Hungary either, or you know,
life is short.
Wherever, you know, any East European or
most
or,
people
you know,
are
Asian
information
countries.
poor.
Yeah, we need to. I think the point you made, or the comment you made, that you know, it's more interesting for you to read about cultural issues, fashion issues. I think that in many ways is more powerful in terms of getting the message out there. An interview I did very recently with a venture capital group who are involved in investment here and are very active promoting Ukrainian investment opportunities in high tech and the IT sector and the artificial intelligence and all these sort of areas. So it's very technical and very specific information. But they said that one of the biggest little boosts they've had recently was when the Antonov Maria plane, you know, the biggest plane in the world, went to Australia. And there was huge coverage of this event, and the Australian media really went to town on this, and they really got very excited about it. I guess not a lot of people go to Australia, or not Perth anyway, perhaps. This is like the far end of Australia. I mean, it's as far. I think it's one of the most isolated cities in the world. I think, and it was a big deal. And they got a lot of media, and they had a lot of concrete calls after that. Not about can you build me a plane or do you have planes, but just like, well, what have you got? Because they saw it and said, oh, wow, I didn't know Ukraine has the biggest plane in the world. They built this thing, they manage it, they maintain it, they run it, they have it. And it really resonated with people. And all of a sudden, Ukraine wasn't being associated with corruption or conflict. It was being associated with excellence. They were saying, these guys are excellent. They're not just good, they're the best. And they manage it. And here it is. And we saw it. And it flew to Australia and it's beautiful. It has a big impact. So, yeah, this is certainly an area that we need to be aware of in terms of our editorial to get these ideas out. I'd love to get some feedback from our other guests.
Anyone else?
About in terms of
no one who speaks English as a foreign correspondent. No more from Mr. Brooks or Mr. Nolan.
Do you have any particular areas you'd like to see more? You'd be interested to hear more about from the West and from English speakers.
I just don't really differentiate between Ukrainian and English sources anymore.
Okay.
Oh, great.
I just look for some information I can just pick up any article. I guess what Ukrainian media don't do much as well is they don't explain regional situation in the regions. So maybe that is why I'm interested in such publications as Odessa Review and other from other cities, because it gives me a better idea about what's happening in these cities. And I would very much like to agree with the idea about featuring stories of successful people, maybe in business, maybe in civil society or something like this. That would be really great.
Okay.
Yeah. We'll do that since this is what people want. We'll definitely do it. So you're absolutely saying great things. I try to read as much of Ukrainian media as I can, and the Russophone Ukrainian media. I'm a native Russian speaker. In fact, I should have maybe said this an hour and a half ago. I was born in Uzbekistan, and I have Ukrainian, Russophone, Russian, Ukrainian, and Jewish Ukrainian roots. In fact, two of my grandparents are from Ukraine. They fled the Nazis in 1941 to Uzbekistan, to Central Asia. I was born in Central Asia, and I lived in Moscow until I was 7. And then I grew up in New York. But so I read the Russophone Ukrainian press, even about Odessa. So there's two kinds. There's a national kind and there's the regional kind. And they both do things well and things badly. So the Ukrainian Pravda don't really have many people or many resources on the ground. So they rely on stringers, or they just rely on synthesizing stuff that they find from Dumskaya and our local Odessa press. So they don't really have the color or the technical aspects of the story. And people like Dumskaya, they put out 50 pieces a day on their site, and some of it's good, some of it's bad, most of it's very mediocre, but they don't have any context whatsoever. So a lot of the times you'll be going through Dumskaya and you see, another unmarked grave from 1937 found at the airport, and one more grave of Bulgarian villages found from 1928 in the thing, and another unmarked grave of Jews shot in 1943 by Romanians found in the oblast. And so and you see this and you say, oh, okay, so I get this. So there's a lot of unmarked graves that are still being found from different kinds of things, and there are different legal issues that have to do with putting up monuments or exhuming them, or even extending the airport. We can't extend the airport because they're unmarked graves of Jews killed by Romanians and local Ukrainians killed by the NKVD in 1937. The local media will write a little write-up about finding a mass grave, but they won't put the story together. And they're not very good at this. Partly because they don't have the resources, partly because most of the people there don't have the literary chops to do it, partly because they don't have the attention span, but there's also no reason for them to do it. There's no synthesis. There's no long quote unquote long form New Yorker style pieces that they're trying to put out. So the people in Kiev have the news down well, but they don't really know what's going on, and the people there who know what's going on, they don't really know how to present it, and so that's an issue.
Doomska is a local website.
Yeah, Doomska is a local website. It's actually owned by Doomska is owned by a member of parliament, Goncharov, who's a Poroshenko. Goncharенко, yeah. Goncharенко, who's a deputy fraction head of Poroshenko bloc, and kind of an important man, owns this thing, but he's not allowed to touch it. But the best newspaper and website.
It has quite a good reputation, I would say.
It has a very good reputation. Broadly speaking, yeah. So there's a lot of good journalism. In fact, Odessa is very, very special. There's 45 TV stations.
Odessa is unbelievable coming from anywhere else in Ukraine.
There's 45 TV stations.
You turn on the Odessa television and you really feel like you're in a different country because it's just endless Odessa channels.
45
Mind boggles
stations.
how I'm sure that
every politician, there's 16 different politicians who own at least one TV station.
None of them can be profitable commercially, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So which is alarming perhaps, and there's a lot of media elsewhere. It's not a Ukrainian phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon that media is often,
like 20
a lost leader for organizations.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
Odessa is a phenomenon.
A lot of it's very bad. A lot of it's very bad journalism. It dilutes some media market.
Yeah. But there's a lot of TV channels, but there's only one.
There's only one English
magazine.
language magazine. That's right.
So maybe that will be in
I mean, we should wrap this up. You got whoever wants to leave can leave. But if there's any questions or comments, anything at all, please.
Sorry for so
No.
much stuff to say.
Open discussion.
Is there gonna be like any specific theme for every monthly issue?
Yeah, they're loose themes. So,
are you gonna like only cover Odessa or like other regions as well?
So we are in the business of covering Odessa, and that is always going to be at least 50% of our coverage. More and more, this is going to become a national magazine for national trends. So stuff like LGBT rights, Crimean Tatar stuff, the politics of the region, like the relationship between Dnipropetrovsk and Kherson, Odessa. More and more we'll cover stuff like that. Big idea stuff more and more we'll cover. More op-eds we'll be doing probably less Odessa literary stuff. We'll be having probably less content about. We have a piece now about the last mayor of Odessa before Tsarist times by the name of Mikhail Brykevich, a Russian aristocrat who collected art, and he founded the Russian art collection at the Ashmolean Museum in Britain. Remarkable figure, a remarkable Odessan art collector and engineer who did a lot of interesting things. We'll be having probably fewer of these very quirky historical pieces, much as I love them, much as I like this. This is interesting for tourists and travelers, who this magazine is partly for. We'll be having less of that and probably more stuff like this young guy named Ian Bateson. I'm sure all of you know.
I know who he is. I haven't met him personally.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
My friend, Mr. Ian Bateson, who runs Gramaska's English division, young guy, is going to be doing more pieces for us about the LGBT and identity, Ukrainian identity formation. But we're going to be going in that direction. So yes, but we're not going to be doing pieces about like Kherson or.
I got it.
Mariupol. We're just not in that
There's no
business.
need in
That's an interesting question, actually.
Yeah.
Another side, very briefly. So Ukraine now has Kiev English language publications. It has a Lviv English language publication. It has an Odessa English language publication. Which other cities in Ukraine would need it or would justify it? Do you think?
Donetsk.
Donetsk would be. Well, I had. No, it's a cheeky one. But I did in the past have a vision for a Donbass that would be distributed in Dnipropetrovsk, Lugansk, Donetsk, and all these cities.
That's a great
That
idea.
would have been great, and it may have saved a lot of lives. But probably going too far. But yeah, that's now been shelved, obviously. But no, but in terms of other Ukrainian cities, I mean, the obvious ones would be Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, probably. Any thoughts? I mean, Kharkiv with a big student population, presumably, that seems. But I genuinely don't know how big the foreign population is there. Would it just be for the local students, or would it be? Is there a big business community there? I know there's a big business per se, but is it international?
No.
Kharkiv is quite a provincial city. Really, there is nothing to like for foreigner.
It was the capital.
But it was.
First capital.
1920s, that's the
Main
greatest art
work
movement in
was-
the country. Kharkiv.
Yeah,
A lot of cultivated people come out.
a lot of good content,
It's
and
actually the second largest city in the country.
yeah, and it's huge, and I mean the student population, a lot of foreign students there.
We have thought about. I mean, in the near future, in the medium term, maybe in the long term, we have thought about expanding a stable of other English language
So
magazines.
it's just a
There's
question
a
of where.
website there, the Kharkiv Times.
Kharkiv Times,
Kharkiv Times, yeah.
which is very new, which is another sign of the times. That to excuse the pun, Kharkiv Times, sign of the times. But it's only emerged, I think within the last 6 months or so. As part of, I think now this growing awareness that Ukraine needs to have these platforms to project itself and to give itself a voice internationally, to provide even if it's on a very basic level, to provide the information. I think that issue, I would hope there's no native speakers there, judging by the content. Put it that way. They're not.
Dear friends, American House is closing in 15 minutes. Thanks for spending this day with us. We look forward to seeing you here next time. Have a good night. Друзі, американський дім зачиняється за 15 хвилин. Дякую, що завітали до нас сьогодні. Ми завжди раді вас тут бачити. До наступних зустрічей та гарного вечора.
So thank you very much, everybody. It's a real pleasure to.
Yeah, this is a lot of fun. You guys are a great crowd, and we're glad you came out on a rainy day. Thank you.
Thanks for your time.
Please, everyone, take a copy or two of your Odessa review and give it to a friend.
Кто был заинтересован в сотрудничестве, есть имейлы
Да.
в журнале на сайте. Пишите, скажите, что вы здесь были, и какие-то вопросы на почту. Мы проверяем все почты, которые опубликованы в журнале.
Да, давайте.
Hello, mate. It's nice to see you.
Nice to meet you in person.
Nice to meet you. Actually, the reason why I came, I thought